Good afternoon, everyone. This is going to be just a short video introducing and contextualizing the selections from Plato's Republic that we're reading for this week and some of next week, so that we don't have to spend as much time in class discussing this part, and also so that you have a little bit of background while you're completing the reading, so you kind of know where the selections that I'm having you read fit into the more general set of arguments. So this should be not a super long video, just to get you started and help you get grounded in the reading. So a little bit about Plato and Socrates. Socrates was an Athenian philosopher who lived in the city-state of Athens between 470 and 399 BCE. And he lived during an important time period of Athenian history, from the height of its power after the wars against Persia to its decline during the Peloponnesian War. He went throughout Athens interrogating the youth and powerful about their beliefs. He called himself a gadfly. You can think of him kind of as an internet troll to some extent. He would go around and ask people, why do you think this? Are you sure? Can you give me another example? Why? He would basically go around doing that to anyone who he viewed to have been intelligent or powerful or wealthy or influential. And we don't actually know much about his life in detail. We know that he served in the army at one point, but the records that we do have about his life suggest that he was both brilliant and very ugly. He eventually was executed for corrupting the youth and impiety in 399 BCE. He was put on trial because his accusers claimed that he was arousing anti-Athenian sentiment in the young people, especially during a time of war. They also contended that he disrespected the gods, and many people believe that he was put on trial because he was irritating to the political establishment. Now, Socrates didn't write anything down. He famously did not. He disagreed with the idea that you could learn from writing rather than dialogue. And so most of what we know about Socrates and his thinking come from dialogues that were written about him, including those by his student Plato and also by other followers of Socrates, such as Xenophon. And with Plato in particular, it's difficult to tell how much of the words that Plato attributes to Socrates are positions that Socrates himself held, and how much of these are positions that are Plato's own thinking that he's put into the mouth of his teacher. We're not going to resolve that question in this class. So for this class, you can kind of use Plato, Socrates as a unity. I will probably interchangeably say Plato says, or Socrates says here. So to contextualize the Republic a little bit more in the context of democratic Athens, during the 5th century BCE, Athens had a radical participatory democracy. All of its citizens, and citizens here were free male inhabitants, could take part in the rule of the assembly. They were randomly selected. It was a principle of rotation. Both members of the assembly and members of the jury courts were chosen by a lottery. And the head administrative aspects, so the people who would be in what we would now think of as the executive branch of government, rotated through the 10 recognized tribes or deems, the subdivisions of the Athenian population. During the Peloponnesian War, reforms were put in place to limit the democratic nature. In 411 BCE, a council of 400 formed an oligarchy that ruled for 4 months before being replaced by a democratic government. And then again in 404 BCE, a pro-Spartan oligarchic regime took power before being replaced after a year by a democratic government. And it's these oligarchies that many critics of Socrates viewed that he was secretly supporting these oligarchic governments because of his ties to some of the men who would then go on to be parts of these oligarchies. And so if we think about the Republic itself in both its kind of narrative and bibliographic context, it was written, the Republic itself was written in around 380 BC. This is after the tumultuous war, after the back and forth pull of oligarchy and democracy, after the death of Socrates, right? Plato is now developing his own philosophical school, the academy. But the narrative, the action of the dialogue occurs in the 5th century during the life of Socrates, before the oligarchic challenges to democratic rule. This is taking place in the middle of much earlier in the 5th century BCE. And so it's coming very at a different time. In the work itself, it begins with a discussion of a religious festival that was happening for the first time. So scholars have dated the kind of, if we were trying to pin when this conversation took place, to the first year of the Peloponnesian War. And so this is kind of, so if we're trying to kind of contextualize that when it's happening, it's early in the Peloponnesian War. And so where many, furthermore, when many of Plato's dialogues, they take place towards the end of the life of Socrates, as he prepares for his trial, as he defends himself at his trial, and as he willingly goes to his death rather than following through with a plan that many of his friends put together to help him escape from jail. This dialogue doesn't have a clear place within the life of Socrates, other than this kind of like, well, it's early in the Peloponnesian War, and it's considered in the context of Plato's writings to be what's known as a middle dialogue, and that is, it takes place after his early writings that more or less were recounts of conversations that Socrates had as he was developing this dialogic form of writing. But he's still, and at this point, he is, many scholars view that Plato is starting to develop his own philosophical theory. And then later in what are known as the later dialogues, Plato basically abandons using Socrates as a character and just invents other characters that he puts his theories in the mouth. So this is kind of a transitional period between Plato exploring philosophical themes that his teacher Socrates explored, and Plato developing his own philosophical theory. And so one thing to think about while you're reading this text is to think about how much of this do you think is a serious utopian blueprint. How much should we take this as Plato recommending what an ideal world would be? And how much should we take this as Plato trying to critique the existing systems of power in democratic Athens? So Socrates is famously called by the Delphic oracle of Apollo as the wisest man in all of the world. And Socrates himself in Plato's Apology says he doesn't understand why the oracle of Apollo said this, because he maintains that he doesn't know anything. And Socrates says that he finally realized that what the oracle meant was that Socrates was the wisest person in the world, not because he knows a lot of things, but because he knows nothing, but at least he admits that he knows nothing. He's not deluded about his knowledge. He doesn't think that he knows more than he does. He's able to accurately assess the limitations to his own knowledge. And so Socrates' philosophy is less about developing a theory and demonstrating its validity than in questioning the people about their opinions about things like justice, things about bravery, piety, virtue, truth, knowledge. He's trying to figure out whether or not the beliefs that people hold about these different values and concepts accurately describe these virtues and concepts and objects themselves. So like, is what the people call just really the nature of justice? Are the common beliefs about what piety is, what truthfulness is, what virtue is, what bravery is, what knowledge is, what philosophy is, what politics is, are those accurate definitions, or are they just like blind ideological opinions of the masses? And so what he does throughout these dialogues that are recorded by Plato and others, and we see this in the Republic, he basically goes around asking people what he thinks or what they think something is, and then subjects them to a series of questions. And so often these involve Socrates saying like, well, what about this case? What about this counterexample? Or, oh, if you believe X, what if we push this belief that you have to its furthest logical conclusion? Are you willing to still defend it? And what he's showing through these questions is that most people don't actually reflect on their beliefs, and they often hold contradictory or inconsistent beliefs, or when you push people on them, they can't defend their beliefs, or they actually realize that they don't actually believe what they think they believe. But what this does is more than just expose that people don't actually know things that they claim to know, but what Socrates' goal, at least in Plato's hands, is that by kind of eliminating all of the inconsistent and contradictory and parts of our knowledge, that we can kind of pare down all these false beliefs that we have and eventually get to a true knowledge of something. That if we kind of subject something to constant criticism, if we subject something to constant kind of interrogation, we'll eventually clean, it's like polishing a diamond, right? We'll eventually clean off all the imperfections and we'll get that true kernel of belief that is true. That part of our knowledge that can withstand all this critical scrutiny, that can be questioned but ultimately defended, it must be something true. And so our interest, or we can think of this as less about the specific answers that Socrates and his friends give if we're trying to reflect on the value of this philosophy more broadly, but on this importance of moral, ethical, and political reflection. Only by subjecting our own beliefs and our popular opinions about justice to critical scrutiny can we actually figure out what justice is, what we know and what we don't know. So in this dialogue, we're jumping in partway through book 2. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a summary of what's happening before the sections that I'm having you read. The dialogue starts with Socrates and his friends at a dinner party at the home of Cephalus after attending a religious festival and they start having a discussion about the nature of justice. And Cephalus says that justice is paying one's debts and telling the truth. But Socrates kind of subjects this to a series of criticisms, like, would you really return a sword to someone who is angry and out of his mind and is planning to harm someone else or himself? Like, well, no, that wouldn't be just. And so Adeimantus, his son, Cephalus' son, says, no. Justice is helping one's friends and harming one's enemies. And Socrates says, like, well, we don't always know who our friends and our enemies are. Many people who we think are our friends are actually our enemies, and so we're helping and harming the wrong person. And eventually, Socrates shows that, like, all these kind of common beliefs about justice are inconsistent. But eventually, someone at the party, Thrasymachus, gets upset, and he says, no, you are all being wrong. You fundamentally misunderstood the nature of justice. That justice is nothing more than what is advantageous to the stronger. And by this, he means that justice is whatever the most powerful person says it is. That acting justly always benefits the most powerful, because there is no such thing as justice. It's just, justice is nothing more than power. It's, if you are just, if you are following the laws, you're being a good moral person, all you're doing is benefiting the most powerful people, because the most powerful people don't care about justice. They do whatever they want. They are strong enough to be unjust and get away with it. So if you are worried about being a just person, it's a sign that you are actually weak. And so Socrates eventually argues that, well, if this were true, no cities would have any sort of harmony or peace, because injustice, this constant fear that someone is trying to take advantage of you, eventually leads to conflict and disagreement and strife, while justice produces harmony. And he eventually kind of bullies Thrasymachus into giving up this argument. And book 2 begins with Glaucon, another member of the Athenian elite and present at this dinner party, and Adeimantus, again, Cephalus' son, and they aren't convinced fully in Socrates' argument. And they argue that Socrates cheated his way out of the argument with Thrasymachus. And Glaucon tells this story of the Ring of Gyges, in which a man finds, much like in Tolkien's Hobbit, right, finds a ring that makes him invisible, and he uses this power of invisibility to kill the king of his city, marry the queen, install himself as king, and he's able to get away with all of this because he does all of the unjust deeds while he's invisible. And Glaucon tells the story to pose the challenge that Socrates, if he really wants to prove that it's best to be just, it's better to be just than unjust, that justice is really something valuable, that he has to prove that it's better to be just even if everyone, including the gods, thinks that you are an unjust person. That it's better that justice is something valuable, not only instrumentally for the benefits that brings you, like a good reputation or wealth or happiness, but that justice is in and of itself a valuable virtue to have, even if everyone thinks that you're an unjust person. And so Socrates basically then tends the rest of this dialogue, these 10 chapters or 10 books in this dialogue, trying to figure out what is a satisfactory account of justice, and then proving that even if everyone thinks that you are unjust, it's still better for you to be just. But where our excerpt picks up, it's right after Socrates says, like, look, it's really hard to figure out what justice is in a singular person, and because we're looking at a virtue of their soul, and a soul is really small. So it's going to be much easier to figure out what justice is in something larger, that we can use this analogy here. That like just like, that if we can see something in a bigger model, then we can kind of apply it to the soul. And that bigger model that they want to use is a city. And this is the same thing that we would do like in, you know, any sort of science, any sort of theoretical exercise, right? You want to develop a model that can help you figure out a particular case. And so they turn to describing justice in the city, and they just engage in this conversation about like, well, if we can build a perfectly just city, and when we describe all the institutions, then we'll be able to figure out what justice is with this example of a perfectly just city. And so they begin this conversation imagining themselves as the founders of a new city that is going to be different than all the other cities that we currently have. And then they're going to build a perfectly just political community. And in the course of that, they're going to discover what justice is. And so in our reading for this week, we pick up with these kind of origins of the city, what Socrates and his interlocutors believe is the nature, how a city comes into being. And we will kind of pick up throughout the Plato's Republic here, how they describe this perfectly just city. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of background that will help you kind of approach this reading. I know it can be a bit dense and complex and hard to jump into, but hopefully this will give you a little bit more grounding and context as we work through this. And I look forward to our discussion on Wednesday. Take care.